We all know the name. Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. We see it in our mind's eye as a place of dreadful shadow and suffocating fear. The dark heart of Mirkwood, where the Necromancer gathered his power for 1,000 years. It's a name that carries the weight of Sauron's malice, the staging ground for the war that would consume the north. A fortress of such evil that it took the combined might of the White Council to drive its master out, and the sheer, undiluted power of Galadriel herself to finally break it down and cleanse its pits. We know the story, or at least, we think we do. We know the villain, we know the fortress, and we know its end. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Here is the gap in the story, the silence that is, in its own way, as deep and as troubling as any of the Necromancer's spells. Before it was Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, it had another name, a much older name, Amon Lanc, the Naked Hill. And that name, that simple, descriptive, elvish name, is the beginning of a mystery far older and perhaps far darker than Sauron himself. Sauron didn't choose that hill because it was empty, or convenient, or strategically sound. He chose it because something was already there. Something was waiting in the soil and the stone, a resonance of shadow that called to his own. What we are about to uncover isn't just the history of a place, but the anatomy of how evil takes root in the world. It's a story about how the deepest darkness doesn't always arrive with a name and a purpose, but sometimes it simply waits, a quiet sickness in the land, for a will strong enough to give it a shape. So, have you ever stood in a place that just felt wrong? A place where the silence felt too loud and the air too still? Let's walk together to the summit of a hill like that, long before the first stone of any fortress was ever laid. To understand what Amon Lanc was, we have to go back, way back. Not to the Third Age, when Gandalf crept through its dungeons, but to the early Second Age. The great cataclysms that ended the First Age are over. Morgoth is defeated, Beleriand is drowned beneath the sea, and the surviving elves are trying to build a new world out of the ruins of the old. In the vast forest east of the Misty Mountains, a new kingdom rises. Greenwood the Great. It's a realm of sylvan elves, the Nandor, those who fell behind on the great journey west, and chose the woods and rivers of Middle-earth over the light of Valinor. They are a simple people, in the best sense of the word. They are deeply connected to the living world, to the trees and the beasts, and their lives are woven into the fabric of the forest. Their king is a Sindarin lord named Oropher, the father of Thranduil and grandfather of Legolas. Oropher, seeking a realm of his own, free from the politics and sorrows of the Noldor, leads his people into Greenwood and establishes his kingdom. And where does he build his capital? Where does he set up his halls? The very heart of this new, vibrant, green realm. On a great wooded hill in the southern part of the forest, a hill that would one day be called Amon Lanc. This is the first jarring contradiction in the official story. The Elves, Oropher's people, lived there. They built their homes there. For centuries, the place that would become the nexus of Sauron's evil in the north was the capital city of an elf king. It was a place of light and life and song. The idea is almost impossible to reconcile with the Dol Guldur we know. Imagine someone telling you that the foundations of Mordor's Black Gate were originally the site of a beautiful public garden. It doesn't compute. And yet, the records, fragmented as they are in Tolkien's appendices and unfinished writings, are clear. The elves were there first. Which forces us to ask the most important question: what changed? And more specifically, why did they leave? The story we are given is a political one. We are told in Unfinished Tales that Oropher eventually moved his entire kingdom north, not once, but 3 times. The first move was away from the south of Greenwood, away from Amon Lanc. The stated reasons are a mix of pride and caution. Oropher was wary of the growing power of the dwarves in nearby Khazad-dûm. He was a cinder from Doriath, and his people held a long and bitter grudge against the dwarves for the ruin of their ancient kingdom and the murder of King Thingol. He was also, we are told, resentful of the intrusions of Galadriel and Celeborn in Lorien, just across the river Anduin. He wanted his own realm, untroubled and uninfluenced by these powerful Noldor exiles. And so he moved north, seeking isolation. It's a plausible explanation. It fits with the known politics of the age, but it feels thin. It feels incomplete. Moving an entire kingdom, uprooting a whole civilization, is a monumental undertaking. To do it because you don't like your neighbors seems like an extreme reaction. There's a subtle hint in the text, a single, ominous phrase that suggests there was more to it. Tolkien writes that even before Sauron's shadow began to fall openly, Oropher's people felt it growing. A shadow was falling on the forest. This was long before the Necromancer was a known entity. This was in the middle of the Second Age, when Sauron was still in Eregion, wearing a fair guise and forging the rings of power. And yet, a shadow was felt in Greenwood, a shadow that seems to have been centered on the very place the Elves had once called their home. This is where the official history ends, and our investigation begins. The Elves didn't just move away from their neighbors. They were retreating from something. They were abandoning their own capital. They were, in effect, fleeing. What could possibly make an entire kingdom of elves abandon their home? What kind of darkness was gathering on that hill that made them pack up their lives and flee north into the deeper woods? The answer, I believe, lies in the name itself. Amon Lanc, the Naked Hill. Think about that name, the Naked Hill. Elves, particularly the Sylvan Elves, are defined by their love for trees. The forest is their home, their sanctuary, their identity. Greenwood the Great was a vast, ancient, and healthy woodland. Why would one hill, right in the middle of it, be naked? It's a stark, unsettling image. A bald spot in an otherwise full head of hair. A scar on otherwise healthy skin. It suggests a place where things do not grow, a place that is barren, sterile, and wrong. And it's highly unlikely it was always that way. Oropher chose it for his capital. It must have been a pleasant, wooded place when he first arrived. So what happened? What could strip a hill of its trees and keep them from growing back for thousands of years? It wasn't logging. The elves wouldn't have done it, and no other power was there to do so. It wasn't a simple forest fire. Forests recover from fire. No, this suggests something deeper. A blight, a poison in the very soil, a spiritual sickness that made the ground itself hostile to life. Imagine the elves living on that hill. At first, it is beautiful, but then, slowly, things begin to change. A great oak on the summit, one that has stood for 1,000 years, withers and dies for no reason. Then another. Seedlings planted by the elves sprout, then shrivel, their leaves turning black. The animals begin to avoid the hilltop. The birds no longer sing in the branches of the remaining trees. A silence begins to fall. A coldness seeps up from the roots of the hill, a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. The elves, so attuned to the life of the green world, would have felt this intimately. It would have been like a sickness in their own bodies. The land itself was dying around them. Or perhaps, more accurately, the land was rejecting them. The very ground beneath their feet was becoming inimical to the life they cherished. This is the horror that the name Amon Lanc conceals. It wasn't a geological feature. It was a wound. A place where the life force of the world had been leached away, leaving behind only naked earth and stone. And it was this slow, creeping, inexplicable decay that drove Oropher away. He wasn't just moving away from the dwarves. He was trying to save his people from a creeping, silent doom whose source he could not identify and whose nature he could not comprehend. He was running from a ghost. This brings us to one of the most chilling and fascinating concepts in Tolkien's entire legendarium: the nameless things. When Gandalf recounts his battle with the Balrog in Moria, he speaks of his long fall into the abyss. He says, "Far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he." This is a profound statement. It establishes that there are entities of profound malice and alien nature in Middle-earth that exist outside the known hierarchy of good and evil. They are not Maiar, they are not orcs, they are not trolls. They are something other, something ancient and primordial, born of the discord in the music of the Ainur before the world began. They are the cancers of creation, gnawing at the foundations of existence. Now, what if one of these things, or something like it, had a connection to Amon Lanc? It doesn't need to be a creature still living there. Evil, in Tolkien's world, leaves a stain. The pass of Cirith Ungol is a place of dread, not just because Shelob lives there, but because of the accumulated terror of millennia. The dead marshes hold the spirits of the fallen from an ancient battle. Places can become saturated with an emotion, with a spiritual residue. Let us imagine, for a moment, a scene, not one from the books, but one that could have happened. Picture a young Sylvan scout in Oropher's service, centuries after they first settled Amon Lanc. The blight has begun. The trees are dying. He is sent to the summit at dusk to see if he can perceive a cause. As he walks, the familiar sounds of the forest fall away. There is no birdsong, no rustle of creatures in the undergrowth. There is only the sound of his own breathing and a low hum in the air, a feeling of pressure against the ears. He reaches the summit, where the last of the great ancient trees stands, its branches skeletal against the dying light. He places a hand on its bark, and it feels cold as gravestone. And then he feels it. It is not a presence he can see or hear. It is a feeling, a deep, abyssal sense of being watched by something utterly devoid of thought or light, a psychic void, a hunger that is not for food, but for life itself. It is the spiritual equivalent of absolute zero. He feels the life in him, the warmth of his elven blood, being drawn out, leached away by the cold, dead soil beneath his feet. He snatches his hand back from the tree and flees down the hillside, and does not stop running until he is back in the light of the elven lanterns, his face pale with a terror he can't put a name to. This is the uncomfortable question we must face. What if Oropher and his people were not just driven out, but haunted? What if they fled from a genius loci, a spirit of the place, that was so ancient, so alien, and so fundamentally hostile to life, that their only option was to abandon the hill to its silent, creeping decay? They couldn't fight it. They couldn't even name it. All they could do was run. This idea elevates the nature of the evil of Dol Guldur from something merely military or political to something profoundly metaphysical. The problem of Amon Lanc wasn't a monster that could be slain with a sword, it was a sickness in the very bones of the world. In Tolkien's creation myth, the Ainulindalr, the world is made from the music of the Ainur, the angelic beings. But one of them, Melkor, the first and greatest Dark Lord, weaves his own themes of discord and strife into the music. This discord, Tolkien tells us, was not eliminated. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. It could not be unmade. This means that from the very beginning, Arda, the earth, was marred. It contains within its very substance the echo of that original evil. Most places are healthy, just as most of a body is healthy. But some places are weak spots. Some places are old wounds that have never healed. They are places where Melkor's discord resonates more strongly. Amon Lanc, I propose, was one of these places. It was a psychic fault line, a place where the barrier between the living world and the ancient, silent void was thin. It's like a recurring nightmare that a person can't shake, but for the land itself. A phantom limb pain for a world that remembers its own violent creation. The blight that killed the trees wasn't a chemical or a magical curse in the traditional sense. It was despair. The land itself was grieving or sick with a sorrow so profound that it could no longer support life. The very will to grow, to reach for the sun, was absent in the soil of that hill. This is a far more terrifying concept than a simple monster. A monster can be understood, fought, and killed. But how do you fight a sickness in the earth? How do you heal a place that has forgotten how to live? You can't. All you can do is leave. All you can do is quarantine it, cede it to the silence and the shadow, and hope that it does not spread. Oropher's flight to the north was not an act of cowardice or political maneuvering. It was an act of triage. He was saving his people by amputating the sick limb of his kingdom, leaving the naked hill to its slow, cold, lonely decay, a monument to an evil he could not defeat because it had no body, no mind, and no name. Now, let's add another layer. We know that in the Third Age, Greenwood the Great becomes Mirkwood. And the primary cause of this change, aside from Sauron's influence, is the proliferation of giant spiders, the spawn of the monstrous Ungoliant. And where do these creatures cluster most thickly? Around the borders of Dol Guldur. Sauron uses them as his sentinels, his spies, his living fence. But what if their connection to the hill is older than Sauron? What if he is not their master, but merely their new neighbor, an ally of convenience drawn to the same darkness they are? Let's consider their matriarch, Ungoliant. She was not a Maya like Sauron. She was something else, a primordial spirit of void and hunger from before the world. Her defining characteristic was her ability to consume light and exude an anti-light, a tangible darkness that smothered all life and hope. After she drained the two trees of Valinor, plunging the world into darkness, she fled to Middle-earth. Her fate is unknown. Some legends say she eventually consumed herself in her eternal hunger. But what if, in her wanderings across Middle-earth in the Elder Days, she passed through the great forest? What if she nested for a time, or even died, on or near that hill? The venom of such a creature, a being of pure anti-life, would not just poison the ground. It would fundamentally alter its spiritual nature. It would be an injection of pure void, a metaphysical poison that would kill the very soul of the land. The trees would die, not from a physical blight, but because their own inner light was being devoured. The soil would become a place of deep, abiding hunger. The hill would become a beacon for all things that thrive in darkness and despair. The spiders, her descendants, would not have been brought there by Sauron. They would have always been there, drawn instinctively to the place where their mother's spiritual poison was strongest. They are not just Sauron's allies. They are a symptom of the hill's original disease. Sauron's arrival, then, is not the cause of the darkness, but the culmination of it. He, a being of immense spiritual perception, would have felt the nature of Amon Lanc from afar. He would have sensed the void, the hunger, the ancient despair clinging to the stones. And he would have recognized it not as a threat, but as a tool, as a foundation. It was a place already hollowed out, already saturated with the kind of despair he wished to spread across the world. He didn't have to build his fortress from scratch. He just had to move into a house that was already haunted. And so we arrive at the heart of the mystery. The core revelation is not that there was a monster on the hill, or a curse, or a specific entity. The something that was already there was far more insidious. It was a memory. It was a trauma, embedded in the rock and soil. Let's construct a final speculative history. Long before the elves awoke, during the years of the trees, the world was not empty. The Valar were in the west, but Middle-earth was a land of vast, silent forests, tended by the Ents and other forgotten spirits of the earth. But it was also a land where the creatures of Melkor, the first orcs and other twisted things, roamed and multiplied in the darkness. Imagine a war, a forgotten, unrecorded war from the dawn of time. A battle fought on that very hill between the shepherds of the trees and the first wave of Melkor's filth. A battle of such savagery, such despair, and such utter, soul-crushing malice that it permanently scarred the land itself. The Ents may have won, but the cost was so terrible that the hill itself died of grief. The trees, so connected to the spiritual state of their shepherds, withered. They could no longer draw life from soil so saturated with the memory of pain and hatred. The hill became naked not because of a physical poison, but because of a psychic one. It was a place of mourning. It was a memorial to a forgotten atrocity. This is the something that Sauron found. Not a slumbering beast to command, but an ancient well of negative spiritual energy. A place where the very fabric of the world was thin with misery. Sauron is a master of spirits, a necromancer. His power lies in dominating the wills of others, in exploiting fear, and in spreading despair. Amon Lanc was, for him, the perfect amplifier. He could tap into that pre-existing wound, that ancient reservoir of pain, and use it to power his own sorcery. He built his fortress on a foundation of grief. The evil of Dol Guldur was not just his own, it was his evil, layered on top of an ancient, unhealed trauma in the world. He didn't just conquer a piece of land, he colonized a wound. And this is the moment where this story of elves and dark lords pivots and becomes a story about us. Because this is exactly how evil works in our own world. We have our own Dol Guldurs. We have places on this earth where the weight of the past is so heavy you can feel it in the air. Go stand on the battlefields of the Somme, where Tolkien himself fought and saw his friends die. Go to Verdun or Gettysburg. Walk the grounds of Auschwitz or the killing fields of Cambodia. The silence in these places is different. It is not an absence of sound. It is a presence of memory. The land itself seems to hold its breath. You cannot explain this feeling with geology or botany. You are feeling the psychic residue of immense human suffering. The land remembers what we try to forget. Tolkien, a man who survived one of the most brutal meat grinders in human history, understood this on a cellular level. He knew that the greatest and most enduring evils are not just the actions of a single dark lord, but the wounds that those actions leave behind in the world and in our collective memory. Sauron, in this light, becomes less a fantasy villain and more a chillingly accurate metaphor. He is the opportunist who rises to power by exploiting old hatreds, old grievances, and old pains. He finds the weakest, most wounded parts of society, the Amon Lancs of the political and cultural landscape, and he builds his fortress there. He doesn't create the poison, he finds it, concentrates it, and weaponizes it. And in this story, we also find an overlooked hero. Not a warrior with a shining sword, but a figure of quiet, profound wisdom. Let's imagine that Sylvan lawmaster, the one who first warned Oropher. The one who stood on the dying hill and felt its sorrow, and went back to his king and said, "My lord, we cannot stay here. This place is sick, its heart is broken, and we do not have the power to mend it." That act of recognizing an unhealable wound and having the wisdom to retreat to preserve the life of his people rather than sacrifice them to a battle against a nameless sorrow. That is a form of heroism we rarely celebrate. It is the heroism of insight, of caution, of knowing which fights cannot be won. In the end, after Sauron is finally and utterly defeated, the story of Dol Guldur comes to a quiet, beautiful close. Galadriel, wielding the power of her ring, Nenya, comes to the fortress. The text in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings is simple and powerful. She threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. This is so much more than a simple act of demolition. It's an act of healing. Laying bare its pits is an exorcism. The forest was cleansed is a restoration. Galadriel is not just destroying Sauron's fortress, she is tending to the ancient wound of Amon Lanc itself. With her power, rooted in preservation and healing, she is finally soothing the ancient trauma, cleansing the soil of its remembered grief, and allowing the life of the forest to return. She is doing what Oropher could not. She is mending the broken heart of the hill. And so we circle back to our original question. What was on that hill before Sauron? A wound, an echo of an ancient sorrow. And why does that matter? It matters because it reframes our entire understanding of the nature of evil in Middle-earth, and by extension, in our own world. Evil is not always an invading army. Sometimes it is parasitic. It is a fungus that grows in the dark, damp places of the world, in the wounds that have been left to fester. It feeds on old griefs, unresolved conflicts, and forgotten injustices. And this tells us that the fight against darkness is a twofold task. Yes, we must confront the Saurons of the world. We must throw down their fortresses and resist their armies. But that is only half the battle. We must also, like Galadriel, learn to be healers. We must find the wounded places, the Amon Lancs in our history and in our communities, and we must cleanse them. We must lay bare the pits, acknowledge the pain that was caused there, and make the ground fertile for new life again. Because if we don't, if we leave these wounds to fester in the dark, we can be certain that sooner or later another necromancer will come along, seeking a foundation on which to build his tower. The story of Dol Guldur is a quiet, epic warning. It tells us that the shadows lengthen fastest where the light of memory has been allowed to die. So what do you think? What are the naked hills in our world, and who are the healers brave enough to make them green again? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.